If you climb to the top of Mount Nebo in the country of Jordan and look across into Israel, like the book of Deuteronomy says Moses did, most days you'll be disappointed with the view. It's usually rather hazy and you can't see much. In fact, this is the last time I was there, this is the picture that I took. Great, huh? Just nothing much more than a blur. But on a good day, this is what you can see. Now for the Middle East, that's pretty fertile land. Okay. Now when the Israelites came to the border of the land that God had promised them, Moses thought it would be a good idea to send out some spies to look over the place and see how populated it was and how fortified it was before they went traipsing off into somebody else's backyard. They came back with glowing reports about the richness of the land. They brought back samples of the produce being grown there. They called it a land flowing with milk and honey, and all the people rejoiced. But there was a caveat. They said, the cities are huge, and they're well fortified, and the land is inhabited by the Amalekites and the Hittites and the Jebusites and the Amorites and the Canaanites and the mosquito bites and the dog bites and the Luddites and the Playwrights. Caleb, one of the spies, said, but we can take them. The rest of the spies said, no, we can't. They're stronger than we are. And then they launched into a bit of, shall we say, exaggeration. They said it's a land that devours its inhabitants. When we saw the Nephilim there, and they were so big, we looked like grasshoppers compared to them. Now, you need to know that the Nephilim were the biblical equivalent of trolls, ogres, and orcs. They were mythological creatures created, designed to terrify people. The spies had mentioned nothing about Nephilim until the prospect of actually taking possession of the land loomed before them. They loved the idea of living in the promised land, but when it came to actually doing something about it, they were less than enthusiastic. So they concocted some fake news to scare the people into backing off the very thing they had come there to accomplish. Now, why would they do that? Why go to all the trouble of making their way from Egypt to the new life in Canaan, a life God had promised them, by the way, only to get cold feet when it came time to put on their big boy pants and claim the land as their own? Well, it could be any number of reasons. They could have been scared. They could have been lazy. They could have convinced themselves that a life of wandering the desert wasn't so bad. It's the age-old devil you know as opposed to the devil you don't know. But for whatever reason, they had second thoughts. They had reservations that sabotaged their own efforts. Now, many years later, Jesus met a paralyzed man by the pool of Bethesda, or sometimes called the pool of Bethesda. Okay, let's look. This is an artist's creation of a model of what the pool of Bethesda probably looked like in Jesus' day. Go to the next one. This is what it looks like today. A lot different, right? Anyway, thank you, Jerry. Some ancient manuscripts claim that the people believed an angel entered the water periodically and healed whoever got into the water first. I think it more likely that the pool of Bethesda was considered what was called in the Greco-Roman world an Asclepion, a temple or other structure in the ancient world thought to be a place of healing. Now, Jesus saw this paralyzed man who had been lying by the pool for 38 years, and he walked up and he asked, "Do you want to be made well?" On the surface, it sounds like a stupid question. Do I want to be made well? No, Jesus, I've just been hanging around here for 38 years because I like the company. But that's not what the man said. His actual response is very telling. He says, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool. And when the water is stirred up and while I'm making my way, someone else steps down ahead of me." He was making excuses. If he hadn't been able to get in the pool for 38 years, something else is going on here. Maybe the pain of his life had become his life. After all, a paralyzed man wasn't expected to work or take care of anybody else. Nobody ever asked much of anything of him. It was a lifestyle he was familiar with, and he certainly didn't have to take any risks. Might not have been a great life, but he'd learned to tolerate it. In that light, Jesus' question doesn't sound dumb at all. Do you want to be made well? Sounds like maybe he didn't. Sort of reminds me of the man who years ago bought a brand new radio, back when there were these big clunkers like that. He took it home, set it up on top of his refrigerator, plugged it in, and tuned to the station WSM in Nashville, Tennessee, home of the Grand Ole Opry. And then he proceeded to pull all the knobs off the radio. He'd set it to the only station he ever cared about, so why should he ever need to change it? The guy by the pool of Bethesda had set his radio to the station he wanted, so why would he ever need to change it? Getting healed would bring a whole new set of challenges, and maybe he didn't think they were worth it. Maybe he was like the woman who was asked by the doctor for a private consultation after he had examined her husband. And the doctor said to her, "Ma'am, your husband is a very sick man. The slightest agitation, the slightest anxiety could kill him. So you're going to have to pamper him. Whatever he wants to eat, cook it. Whatever he asks you to do, do it. Whatever he desires in the bedroom, humor him. Wherever he wants to go, go. Remember, even the slightest irritation could kill him." Wife walked out in the waiting room, sat down. Her husband said, "What did the doctor say?" And she said, "He said you're going to die." You want your husband to be made well? Maybe not. Not worth the trouble. Change is hard. There's always a cost. Do you want to be made well? I don't know. What's the catch? Heard about a college dean who thought it nothing short of shameful that male students were sneaking into the women's dorms on campus. So on the first day of school in the fall, the dean held a convocation and he said, "We've instituted some new rules around here this year. From now on, the women's dorms will be totally off limits for all male students. Anybody caught in a woman's dorm will be fined $20. Anybody caught breaking that rule the second time will be fined $60, and anybody caught breaking that rule and found in the women's dorm for a third time will be fined $180. Are there any questions?" One guy in the back of the room raised his hand and said, "How much for a season pass?" There's a cost to change, and there's a cost to keeping things the way they are. Which one are you willing to pay? See, there are plenty of reasons for not changing, even when I know it's probably for the best. The risks look too high, the cost is too steep, the work is too taxing. Do you want to be made well? I don't know. Will it mean getting serious with prayer? Will it mean reading and digesting the Bible? Will it mean committing to worship every week instead of just when it's convenient or when I feel like it? Will it mean addressing the greed and misplaced loyalties rampant in American culture? Will it mean a larger financial commitment that comes off the top of my income instead of the bottom? Will it mean that family and friends are going to label me as radical or un-American or a fanatic or a naive dreamer or just downright crazy? Is that what it means to be well? Then I'll take a pass. I'll just continue hanging around this pool. Thank you very much. I was in a seminary class. One of my fellow students was a lady from Florida. And I don't remember what we were talking about, but at one point she said, there's a church in our area with a slogan they always have on their church sign out in front of the building. And they put it on their publications, they have it in all their advertising, and their slogan is this: growing without changing. Growing without changing. Now, there was a guy in the class who had been a medical social worker, and he said, "Don't they know that's the definition of cancer? A cell that grows but does not change is cancerous. Growing but not changing is a pretty sick slogan for a church. It's a pretty sick slogan for life as well." I'm sure the guy by the pool had learned a lot in 38 years. He'd probably grown in lots of ways, but he hadn't changed. I know I've learned a lot in my 65 years, and I've grown in lots of ways, but have I really changed in fundamental ways? Have you fundamentally changed? Do you want to be made well? There are lots of good reasons for not changing. But there's one excellent reason to change. You can be made well. You can be a better someone than you are now. When the man by the pool whined his pitiful excuse for staying the same as he'd been for 38 years, Jesus went straight to the heart of the problem. He said to him, "Stand up, take up your mat, and walk." He told him to take a step, to take a risk. He told him to do something, start somewhere. When my brother was a little boy, if he got bored, his standard line was, "Let's do something." Jesus said the same thing to the paralyzed man. Let's do something. Let's start on a new path. Let's take a chance. Let's explore a possibility. Stop talking about how great things could be and start fashioning the future you endure, that you envision. Heard about a king who received the gift of 2 magnificent peregrine falcons, the most beautiful birds he had ever seen. He gave them to the royal falconer to be trained. And after several months, the falconer came to the king and informed him one of the birds was flying majestically, soaring high in the sky, but the other bird had not moved from its branch since the day it had arrived. The king summoned healers and sorcerers from all over the land to tend to the falcon, but nobody could make the bird fly. He asked various members of his court, but every day the king looked out the window of the palace and saw that bird still sitting on its perch. Finally, he decided that perhaps someone with a closer connection to nature could figure out what to do, so he commanded, "Go get a farmer." Next morning, the king was thrilled to see the falcon soaring high above the palace gardens. And the king shouted, "Bring me the man who worked this miracle." And the farmer was brought before the king, and the king asked, "How did you make the falcon fly?" And the farmer replied, "It was very easy, Your Majesty. I simply sawed off the branch where the bird was sitting." I wonder, do I need Jesus to saw off the branch where I'm sitting? Do I need something drastic to kick me away from the pool, to take up my mat and walk? The paralyzed man took a risk. There were lots of good reasons for not changing, but there was one excellent reason to change. He could be healed. He could become a new person, a better person, a disciple of Jesus. Was there a cost involved? You bet there was. This healing took place on a Sabbath day, and when the religious leaders, you know, those guardians of keeping things the way they've always been, when they saw this man toting his mat around the city, they scolded him for working on the Sabbath, and a huge brouhaha ensued. Now, make no mistake, change is always gain and loss. But the two are not equal. What you gain by taking the risk to follow Jesus is always more than what you lose. Do you want to be made well? Jesus is waiting for an answer. Most of you know Kathy Juergens, very active member here for many years, and she's now a pastor of a F.C.C. church in Sedalia, Missouri. Well, one Sunday, Kathy had the joy of baptizing 5 young people into the family of faith. 4 of them were confirmands. One of them was the brother of a confirmand, ages ranging from 5th grade to 8th grade. She had decided to call each one of them to the font in alphabetical order. Now, the first boy that she called was a kid that Kathy says is really a sweet, sweet boy, but he's one of those young'uns that's about 2 steps behind his peers. You know the type? The type that in class will always ask questions that are slightly or completely off topic. That was this kid. So he came up to the font. Kathy dutifully baptized him in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And the plan was for him to go and take his seat, and so the next kid could come up to the font. But instead, he turned to Kathy and asked, "What do I do now?" Now, obviously, he was asking about the protocol he was supposed to follow, but I don't think he could have asked a more profound question. Do you? What do I do now? Now that I'm baptized, do I just warm a pew every Sunday? Do I toss a few dollars in the offering plate? Do I separate my faith from my education, from my friendships, from my family, from my career, from my politics? Gosh, if I let Jesus interfere with that stuff, I'll have no end of trouble. Kathy had the presence of mind enough not to say, "Just go sit down." No, instead she said, "What do you do now? You're called to follow Jesus as best you are able." So the question stands for you and for me. What do I do now? In the face of this world's greed, hatred, fear, and indifference, what do I do now? Jesus says, if you want to be made well, stand up, take your mat, and walk.